turn on the recording. So here we go. We'll mute everybody. Let's see. Okay, everybody's muted.
Barbara isn't muted. She's such a blabbermouth.
Okay, there we go. So everybody's muted. And so this is our last session on astrology. Next week, we'll do Labyrinth. And then we have our final wrap-up session, which will be very different than the wrap-up session from a year ago, as you'll see. And then we have to figure out what to do. So that's where we're at.
We're thinking we're going to hit our stride in the third year, just so you know.
Well, you can see how we changed it, anyway.
All good.
We'll sort it out. So anyway, so our thought was, since we've done two of these things, to maybe do a little review, and then we'll launch into tonight's class. So you're on.
No, you review what we talked about last time.
What we talked about.
I'm coming back to life, by the way, but it's still a struggle.
What we did last time.
Yeah, we watched the videos with Robert Hand
and Stephen Foster.
Stephen.
So you saw the two
Forrest.
So you saw the two astrologers, like I said, talking shop, and they're clearly both. They're very busy. They clearly both have lots of clients. So someone besides them wants to understand whatever astrology has to say about their lives.
They both teach a lot too.
Yeah,
a great deal, and write books.
Yeah, so that is kind of, and that also astrology had, just fallen out of favor until I want to say the 60s or 70s, when it came back in with New Age, whatever, and that led to a renaissance, which you see today. And the one person that we haven't really talked about is Liz Green, who is a Brit and has.
She's an expatriate American, but
yeah, she's in London, where, who is it? Boswell said, "If you tire of London, you tire of life itself." So anyway.
Well, I was delighted to learn that Nancy's grandfather and Judith's father-in-law was an astrologer. That's just wonderful to my mind. So he was making it through that period, that dry spell where nobody was talking about it. So that was real independence of mind and spirit to keep going with it when there was so little community for it. It was nearly lost. When I started studying in the late 80s, they were just so glad to have a young person. They were just thrilled because they were afraid it was going to die out. They were afraid it would be lost again. So I met one of the people who had developed it's called a 90-degree dial. That's part of the Uranian school. You heard them talking about the various schools in New York. And my second teacher they both were, in a way, my first and second teacher, they knew each other, part of that Uranian school. And they were working very hard to be very precise and mathematical and logical and scientific. And they used this method called a 90-degree dial that would help you find midpoints. And so they were looking at it very precisely and very mathematically. So the midpoint between two planets at 90 degrees would be 45 degrees. So you would use the dial to find a planet right at 45 degrees. You could put that on a center line and get all the symmetries in the chart, but you had to transpose the chart. You couldn't use a normal one onto they had all these printouts that they innovated And that's where these graphic ephemerides come from, with the wavy lines that show the transits that I really love. So I use a lot of tools from that school. And it was very progressive. And it was, they were really working hard to be more science-based. And last week it came up about the one of the statisticians was Michel Gauquelin from France, who set out to debunk astrology and ended up proving it. And he founded a new school of thought himself, that they wanted to move away from the superstitious, mainstream, form of it, the sort of pop astrology. So they called that cosmobiology. And he published a lot. And another woman, I couldn't think of her name last week, was Lois Rodden. And she did a lot to clean up our way of handling data. There's Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl. We're just
Yeah, the other thing that's happened is, doing these natal charts is very laborious, and but having computers where they have the ephemeris, where you can see where the different objects are as they orbit around the sun, is a huge advantage toward not making mistakes and doing things very quickly. So now you can do these natal charts, and what would you say?
I usually spend about 2 hours preparing, whereas it would have been at least a full day endeavor for somebody to calculate it all by hand. It was a real commitment for astrologers to do all that. You actually had to usually go to a library to find the latitude and longitude of a given city where the person was born, and then do the calculations from that. And it was extremely time consuming and very open to error. You had to know about the time zones, and there's places in the country that don't change with everybody else. they stay on God's time. And there are pockets that follow daylight savings time and pockets that don't. Wartime, is different. And there are just all kinds of wrinkles. And certain older charts, I know to ask them, is this time from your mother or is it from the hospital? Because there were times when people were doing one or the other. And so that could throw it off by as much as an hour. And it's very difficult to track the movement of the moon because it moves so quickly. But that's very important. That's considered one of the two lights that we count the sun and moon as planets or the lights. And the sun moves a degree a day, roughly, and the moon can move up to 3. There could be a fast moon or a slow moon. And I gave up. I learned how to do it when I was studying, but I just thought it's just too much effort, and I'm always going to be worried about making a mistake, and then you're not saying something accurate. And I learned to trust the accuracy of it. But every astrologer has had an experience of working with the wrong time for somebody. And that could be really interesting. And I started to share last week when I worked my way through, I went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn as a child, but then I went to the Manhattan campus as an adult when I went back for desktop graphics. I had done it old school before the desktop revolution. There was a guy there in the lab. I worked my way through in the lab. And he did Ayurvedic astrology, the Indian type. And I did Western. And we would have these conversations that other people would just scratch their heads and walk away. But we were having a great time. I remember once there had been this really nasty virus going around of, I think it was strep throat. Everybody had something going on with their throat. And he was out for a few days and came in. I said, "Oh, so did you have that throat thing going on?" I said, "I'm one of the few people that I was here all the way through. Everybody was out." He said, "No, it wasn't that for me." He said, and then he looked at me and laughed. He said, "Oh, for me, it was a fever. It was my head." And that's because for him, it was in Aries, which rules the head and headaches and fevers. Whereas for everybody else doing Western thinking, it was in Taurus. But he didn't even, he wasn't in Taurus rules the throat. He wasn't even aware of the eclipse, but still psychologically it translated into, a head thing for him. Whereas for everybody else, whether they knew astrology or not, they all had sore throats. So it's just funny how it works. So we were amused and people thought we were absolutely insane, but it made sense to us that even unconsciously, we have our frame of reference. And somehow the symbolism, will play out. So
I mean, there's another thing too, which with the internet now, of course, there's lots of software packages available online where you can go. Some of them are free. You can just go ahead and do your own natal chart right there without having to, pay for or download any software and so forth. So it's a very different time for astrology in terms of being able to do things and not make mistakes along the way. So what would you like to cover now?
Well, I was really enjoying the conversation we were having at the end of the class, and I felt like we cut it short. So I was just wondering, were there any unfinished questions or points that anybody wanted to follow up with before we start going forward? Does anybody remember?
This isn't a question, but I really got interested after last week into delving a little bit more into Jung and astrology. And I came up with this quote of his that I really love. He suggests astrology represents the sum of all the psychological knowledge of antiquity. I thought that was pretty impressive.
Oh, wonderful. I would agree. And I think it was a very elaborate psychology. What I like about it is it's not just looking at people's neuroses, which I feel is the Freudian approach. It's more just looking at people as they are in their cultural context and transcending their cultural context. And I felt like when I learned astrology, it was really like learning a kind of interpersonal anthropology. And I was able to become a lot less judgmental because of that, because I could say, well, that's just his chart, that's his culture, that's his way of translating his experience. So I deal with people all the time who are difficult, especially in the legal system that's become like my job the last 10 years. And I just say to myself, well, I don't know what they're dealing with. I don't know what their history is. I don't know what their dynamics are. And I feel the chart shows that. And I've never looked at a chart, like I've looked at, I'll just get political for a minute, like George Bush's chart and the junior. And he came up when I studied Reiki like 20 years ago, we asked permission, we energetically, we decided to give him Reiki. I developed so much sympathy for him and compassion that I felt that was really important, to see him as a vulnerable human. even though his ideas weren't my cup of tea. So the more time goes by, the more I'm affected by things like that. And, just that everybody has, it's like you've got blinders and mirrors and, tunnels and different things going on that's unique to each of us. It's not our sun sign. Sometimes a person's sun sign is the least of their chart. You could have 9 planets in another sign besides your sun sign, and that's not going to weigh much in terms of the overall configuration. What we look at mostly is the planets rather than the constellations. The constellations are the backdrop of where the planets are and where they're moving. But what astrology...
There's a really I'm jumping in. There's a really interesting aspect historically to how astrology was perceived. There was an astrologer to royalty in the 19th century in England who was asked, because he was doing specific charts for specific people over, in a very detailed fashion, but was asked by the Times, could you produce something that we could write in our newspaper for mass circulation? And the only thing that he could do would be to come up with daily or weekly sun sign movements that would affect some of the categories. So that was kind of how astrology moved from being specific and customized to individuals into mass circulation, and getting recognized as kind of sun sign is all that astrology was about. With the advent of the internet, though, interestingly, and Bart, you referenced a lot of the packages out there, and I did know a couple of guys in Seattle who put together some really interesting stuff. Their mantra, their chant was that the internet provides mass customization for the first time in astrology. That basically you're breaking with the tradition and thoughts of the 19th century of mass circulation and moving it into a more realistic, more relevant aspect to the individual through mass customization. I just thought it was an interesting point that I heard in the 90s that I'd bring up now.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that's definitely true. It was a very elite thing. Ancient times, it was really just for kings, maybe queens. And it was still fairly elite until fairly recently. We didn't really start recording birth times in the United States until the 50s. They were doing it earlier in Europe. But it is absolutely true that it's making it, that's part of the Aquarian age, is that it's making all these things accessible. This technology, astrology itself is a spiritual technology. So we one thing we thought we might do is,
I mean, do you want to go through we did it, there's a book that Liz Green wrote on Jung's approach to astrology. So we can go through that briefly, and then we can go through Jung's natal chart, which we have. Yeah, well, I'll put it up. Yeah.
we have it
Yeah.
in the
So
computer.
let us hold on one sec while we go do this. Let's see. Here
So
we are.
do I have the book? Oh, here it is. Will this be backwards?
No, it's going to show up here in a sec. It's on
Okay.
page 2.
Oh, okay. Here it is physically, and here it is.
Okay, so here we are.
Image form.
We're going through Liz Green's book, and she's written many books on astrology, and is clearly very not simply knowledgeable, but she's very cultured, and so
I keep trying to turn this off.
just a sec. So that's what we're going to cover here. This is just a summary of the book that she put together. As we know, Jung never actually published anything on astrology, although
Other
he,
than the synchronicity book.
yeah, although he, as we've been talking about, probably did a chart for every single client that he had, and taught himself, in incredible detail about astrology. So that's what in the world did Jung do? So that's what we're dealing with here, is all really coming out of this book called Jung's Studies in Astrology, Prophecy, Magic, and the Qualities of Time, which just came out recently. You have to go through, for example, the Red Book that we talked about, and you'll find these things scattered throughout there. And so what we're going to do is capture some of the quotes that are directly from Jung about what he saw in doing these things. And
She wrote another companion book to this book about the Red Book per se, which is extremely astrological.
Right.
And she's the first person really kind of bringing it out of the closet for lay people to see the extent of his involvement. She's a Jungian analyst and a Jungian astrologer.
Remember that Jung did his Red Book, I think, from 1912 to 1930, but it was not published until 2009. Okay, everyone knew there was something there, but they had to actually have some
the family
publisher go ahead and agree to do it. So
right. Well, the family was holding it back.
Yeah, and so this is the actual set of chapters to the book here. You can see, and we're just going to follow again exactly this format here. Is there anything you want to say about any of this? Or we can just run through it.
Yeah, I think we'll just run through it.
Okay.
We're just sort of following the outline of the book, which is definitely worth reading if you can get your hands on it in its own right, whether you're interested in astrology or not. I think she's my personal favorite astrologer, and what I like is her scholarship. She's extremely scholarly, as well as poetic and psychological, and just really deeply entrenched in the myths. And I've always loved the psychological way that she works with myths, because I think there's so much insight and wisdom there.
So we're just starting here. And again, we've touched on this before, that Jung was very interdisciplinary. He was always on the edge of things like psychology or religion or magic or mysticism or medicine. He himself was very knowledgeable in medicine. So
He was a doctor.
You end up with a very far-ranging, holistic view of all these things when you deal with Jung. Remember that the locals called him a Hexenmeister, which in German means warlock. The Hexen is a spell, so you're a master of spells, is what this is. And I think a warlock has more negative connotation. Hexenmeister is more neutral, even positive. So what we've seen here, Jung just learned enough astrology that he could do natal charts for each of his clients, and he did this because he thought it would help. When the clients were there, they were in a world of hurt, and he was able to help them get through. If this was in his toolkit, then so be it.
He didn't talk about it with the clients. Most people feel it's not a good thing to be a therapist and an astrologer for the same client, because it's too invasive. When you're doing therapy, you're really unfolding in your own way, at your own pace, and driving. When you're having a chart done, it's the opposite dynamic, the astrologer. And so I sort of went back and forth on this line, and in the end, I decided I would rather be an astrologer. But I do sometimes do ongoing therapy with people, but I don't, even if I'll look at their chart and I'll talk about it, but I don't do it for them. I don't spend 90 minutes talking to them with a tape recorder running the way I do for an astrology client, because it's the energy is going in the opposite direction. And it's me talking about the person to themselves, which is just not the discovery process of therapy.
But my guess is it made him a much better therapist because he fully understood their, like, the idiosyncrasies of why things were happening, and then could probably help them move to a better place quicker.
I think so. I would say so. I always feel it's objective. It's a lot more objective than my supposition and my assumptions. You're still making interpretations, but there's a structure there that it keeps me honest. You know,
Mhm.
you can see at least what people's themes are. And I knew my father for 40 something years before I said to him, you know, you always talked about your father with us, but it looks like your mother was actually more important to you. And he said, well, yes, I knew that. I said, oh, but you never spoke about that. And I didn't think it until I looked at your chart. And he said, oh, well, that is true. I was closer to her, which, you know, to me, that I've had enough objective experiences that I can say I don't believe in it. I know. But what I think it's saying isn't what most people would think that I would think that it's saying. It's not saying what's going to happen next Thursday to somebody. So, but he did do them. He had them available and referred to them himself for all of his clients. And they had to be calculated by hand. That he wasn't sending off to some service and getting it done. So
that's this. So then, you know, here Jung again deals with the sun and the moon and the major planets, and they end up bringing out certain psychological or psychical constituents. These are these archetypes of the human character, and this is why he felt astrology can give useful information about your character. So there's an influence there of these archetypes on these different, the sun, the moon, the planets, that is influencing you, or you're influencing it. It depends on, you know, how you want to look at it. And so the religious mysteries of later antiquity dealt with freeing man from harmony, or in other words, freeing man from the compulsive quality of the foundations of his own character. So these planets, the sun and the moon, are the ones, you know, that are driving a lot of these things or influencing them to some extent. And that was why he thought it was worth, you know, getting into astrology.
and that's what we think of as fate. But I loved the way Robert Hand and Stephen Forrest put it in their discussion. It's because everything's connected. It's because everything's one. That's why it seems that the planets are causing events on Earth. It's not. It's that it's all one thing. It's all of a piece. But the way I think of it is you can see it more clearly in the abstract relationships between the planets when you translate. It's mostly the angles between them actually that we're looking at. It's not the planets per se, but then you're seeing in the geometric relationships, you're seeing the interplay of the myths which are like the content.
Okay. There were many people have observed this, which is what there's these analogies or correlations between astrological configurations and psychological events. So that is what led astrology to having such a huge impact, or having it taught in all of these universities for centuries. Was you should pay attention to this. There's something here, and you ignore it at your own risk. The other side to it was astrology, like the collective unconscious with which psychology is concerned, really consists of symbolic configurations. So we have, each of the planets, the sun, the moon, have their own symbols, and the symbols by themselves have meanings, but the meanings evolve, or they're dynamic. They're not static. So we've chosen to name the planets after the Roman gods. Jupiter is
Zeus of
Zeus. Which way does it go? Zeus was the
Greek.
Was the Greek, and Jupiter's the Roman, and Mars.
The signs are the Greek. So Aries is the equivalent of
Mars.
Right. And we tend to think of the signs as the zodiac. They're actually different, but we think of them as the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so that's Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer. And those are ruled by the planets of Mars, Venus, Mercury, and the moon. So there's a correspondence between the ones that have the Roman names and the Greek names.
Right. And the other thing is that the astrologer doesn't always consider his statements to be possibilities. So one of the things to keep in mind is sometimes the interpretation is too literal, and you should nuance it using the symbols. The people do err in this direction.
But that goes both ways. I was doing a tarot reading for a woman once, and the death card came up, and I said, well, it looks like you might have experienced a real ending recently, and it may have been, a profound loss of some kind, but it doesn't have to be literal. It could be symbolic and, just psychological. And I was going on and on and on. She said, it's okay. My father just died, So sometimes it is literal too. So I said, sure. Okay. And that too, that's symbolic and real, right?
Sure. So the other thing is to do a horoscope, or to gather some statistics that would try and show that there's something for astrology. You don't need to believe anything in astrology. That's but you can carry out all kinds of experiments just for curiosity, and carry out alchemical procedures, without thinking that you're ever going to turn lead into gold, just for the curiosity of it. Or you can attend a Catholic Mass, and you don't believe in the transubstantiation of the bread turning into the body of Christ and so forth. This was how Jung suspended his belief. He held astrology at bay, and just used it. And he said, does this make any sense? Does this fit in with what I'm trying to do here to help people out?
I studied it for about 3 years before I made up my mind. And there were times I got totally frustrated, and I thought, well, this is just self-referential. It's just chasing its own tail. But I would say to myself over and over again, these people weren't idiots. They wouldn't just fool themselves so easily. And it wasn't until I had my teacher said, don't say, I don't want to hear a word of opinion until you've all looked at 100 charts. And he gave us a lot of published data of charts. And that's a really helpful way to learn with famous people and their charts. You can see their work in it. You know, it's really interesting. If you know a writer really well, you can see his style in the chart and publications and things like that. So I went into it as a skeptic, but I thought it was interesting enough. I loved the mythology anyway. It was interesting enough to study it without having any certainty at all. I was definitely at least an agnostic, you know, going in for 3 years until I saw enough of them working in their own right that I said, okay, there's something going on here. I would call it synchronicity. I don't think it's a causal relationship, but now I'm coming to understand causality very differently. I think it's subtler and more complex than I initially thought it was. So
now we get into, again, this is all what Jung is displaying as his understanding of astrology. So the very well-known motif of death and resurrection, you know, is found in myths all over planet Earth, and for ages and ages. So the meaning immediately behind it is that the sun every day comes out of the sea. It is born and goes through the heavens and then dies. It sets in the sea, and then the next morning it repeats again. You have birth and then death, and the resurrection that goes with it. So at the very bottom, it's really nothing but psychology, but it might be an unconscious psychology that's simply being projected into the heavens, is what was going through Jung's head. And the myths never were and never are made consciously. They always arise from the unconscious. Your unconscious is always cranking away, and you know, it sees these things going on, and the way that it can deal with them is to create myths, or, if you will, archetypes that go with this. So
Jung felt that dreams were individual myths and myths are collective dreams. And that always really stayed with me. I think that's true. When they're collective, they become written down, and there's a kind of consensus that goes on with them, and they morph when they become collective, but they're no more conscious than our dreams are, and they express these psychological themes just so brilliantly.
Which I have to add in here, because there's obviously myths across all cultures and religions, but there are reoccurring stories or reoccurring themes, right, that kind of lay themselves out very similarly, despite those cultures having been on two opposite sides of the earth. And then, there's the talk that oftentimes similar or cultures would arise similar discoveries or similar advances at a similar time, again on opposite sides. Like there was it was a subconscious thing, right? It was humans or the soul evolution to a certain point to discover the next thing, and they happened simultaneously. And then the stories or those myths were created to capture that movement into the next development or whatever.
yeah, I mean, for me, it's the fact that there's pyramids all over the earth.
Right, I was just thinking that.
And, why is that? Was there some communications there, or did they they collectively arise, what was behind it, what was driving this, to have all these different cultures building pyramids.
And labyrinths. They're found all over the planet. They're like chiseled into cave walls by people in Peru and Europe, that they weren't sailing back and forth and passing this on. They're all over, Sweden and Latin America. They're just absolutely ubiquitous. And a lot of cultures have the story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. And that had to do with the age of Taurus passing through the age of Taurus. And the sacrificial bull in the center of the labyrinth was about the guy's wife was supposedly fornicating with this bull. I see that as a way of saying she was worshiping it, and it was atavistic to go back to the age of Taurus. And that's like the Hebrews when they were being led out of Israel, and Moses disappeared up onto the mountain for too long, and they didn't know what to do. So they were melting things down to create this huge golden calf. And he was so furious at them because they were going back to the previous age. They were supposed to be in the age of Aries now with one God and, all the dogma of that age. And they were being, recidivist, going back to the age of Taurus. So it wasn't just idolatry, it was going back that was the problem. But these stories of the Minotaur and the labyrinth are like so prevalent everywhere. Why? So this is an example. Do you want to read this one?
Yeah, so how did Jung learn astrology? Well, Jung being Jung, he went back to primary sources. So for him, you have Ptolemy, who I believe lived in the 1st century, 2nd century AD, who wrote a book there called Tetrabiblos, which was probably written in Greek, definitely, one of the first books you could find on astrology that had any coverage there. Then we go to, say, the 9th or 10th century AD, when the height of the Arab Renaissance, and he read a Latin translation from the Arabic there. That's the great conjunctions there, if you translate the Latin. And then we go up to like the 1500s, 1600s, with a commentary on what Ptolemy did concerning astrology. So that's where he started from, not exactly where most people today would start from. We'd go to Google or we'd go to YouTube, but anyway, that's what he did. And then at the same time, in the 1930s, there was a lot of work being carried out at different universities on gathering statistical evidence for or against what has come to be called extrasensory perception. And so Jung looked at a lot of these things as well, but these were all, if you will, in some sense theoretical. And Jung being Jung, he then got down to brass tacks, and he went after 3 different sources, which are how to really do a natal birth chart. So one chap here, this guy Alfred John Pierce, had a book on this. There was another book by someone who went by the pen name Raphael, but it was actually, his real name was Robert Cross Smith. And then finally, there was an American, Alan Leo, who had books and classes on how to do natal birth charts. And so Jung, I think, actually took a class from Leo on this stuff, just because he doesn't want to just be up in the clouds. he wants to really understand what's going on here so he can get his hands on it. And that's what we're going to come back to when we do Jung's birth chart. So
Helen Leo was a theosophist too.
yeah. So we have other things here. There were an individual, Max Heindel, who had some activities in astrology that Jung was aware of. And then Jung signed up for some of these classes to learn how to do the birth charts, which led to someone finding a horoscope data sheet, which was actually Jung's natal birth chart, okay? And another individual, John Thorbrum, who was a patient of Jung, offered to do Jung's natal chart. So Jung said, that's great, let's do it. And finally, we get up here into the Aquarian age, which we're in now. And you know, here Jung is saying, we'll have made great strides in overcoming the lust of the flesh and the lust after the flesh. You know, that's when you know you've made it into the age of Aquarius. So I have no idea why that shows up here on this list of things for his astrologers, but he felt strongly that the age of Aquarius would put a lot of these other things behind us that he didn't view as all that productive.
It's called the sign of brotherly love.
Right. So here we have the constellation Virgo, which is the Immaculate Celestial Virgin. And this has ears of wheat that are contained in the sign of Virgo. This suggests that these are ideals profitable to the growth of your soul. So just looking at this, you keep that in mind and you say, if you look at the mother ideal of Virgo during the age of Pisces and following Christ's example of sacrificial service, then the Immaculate Conception becomes an actual experience to each of us. Okay, here we have Virgo, the Immaculate Celestial Virgin, and Christ being born of the Immaculate Celestial Virgin.
In backwards order, it goes Virgo, Leo, Cancer.
Right. So Christ, which, you know, here, this is what I didn't understand. You have any idea what he's thinking of here?
He's talking about the polarity between Aquarius and Leo.
Oh, so
That's
this
what
is
he's
within
referring
us.
to.
Okay.
Right.
Aquarius is within us, and this is an age of love. So
I think he means the archetype of the Christ is within all of us.
right, that's it. That's what it is, right? And so when we get to the winter solstice, the Immaculate Madonna is ascendant, and that's when we get past this, when the newborn sun, oops, hold on one sec. When the newborn sun commences to rise to the task of growing the grain and the grape, and the sun is therefore an apt symbol of the Savior, born to feed his flock on the spiritual bread of life. So some of these things I think are like, they work them in after the fact. They're looking around and, you know, can we put this together with that and so forth. So some of these things I take with a grain of salt, but anyway.
Well, it is thought that the winter solstice is that's the time when all the sacrificial gods are said to be born. You know, there's a list at the end of our syllabus that shows them all, from Dionysus, you know, to Jesus. That's the resurrection of the sun is the fundamental symbolism of the annual cycle, which the sun dies and is reborn at the winter solstice. That's why Christ's birth was Jesus's birth was moved to December 25th was the winter solstice. So he's not just making that up.
Right.
And they think he was actually born in March and was a Pisces, as the symbol of the fish. That makes sense to me with his character as well. As a Pisces myself, I say
Well,
that.
plus he had the shepherds there had lambs.
Right.
You know, when are the lambs born? They're born in the spring. So anyway, so now we go into these are things that are again out of the Red Book, but it's Jung who put together these little dialogues. So this is written down by Jung. So Jung starts off with some professor talking to him about nowadays the imitation of Christ's death leads to the madhouse. And Jung, of course, replies, "That's hardly to be doubted, Professor." So the man has wit. He is obviously somewhat maniacally aroused. Do you hear voices? So this is what he's saying to Jung. Do you hear voices? And Jung says, you bet. There was a huge throng of Anabaptists that swarmed all through the kitchen, probably singing all kinds of songs. And the professor says, now there we have it. Are the voices following you? And Jung says, oh no, I summoned them. So this is classic Jung, or this is, you can see kind of, it's humorous, but he's trying to get across this point of, the death and rebirth and how this leads to these sorts of things. And he picked a particular example here. I don't know that having a throng of Anabaptists going through the kitchen is the one I would pick, but that's what he picked. So as a follow-up on this, you've got to make an emotional state the basis or starting point for the procedure, okay? And you have to make yourself as conscious as possible of the mood. You sink into it without reserve, noting down on paper all the fantasies and other associations that come up. So again, this is what Jung was doing when he was doing his Red Book. He was writing all of these things down. And then the fantasy must be allowed the freest possible play, yet not in such a manner that it leaves the orbit of its object, meaning the emotional effect. So you have this fantasy going on, but it can't be objective. It has to have the proper emotional effect. And it's not a question of the free association that's recommended by Freud for the purpose of dream analysis, but instead is elaborating the fantasy by observing the further fantasy material that adds itself to the fragment in a natural manner. So he's going in a very different direction than Freud here by just concentrating with this active imagination here on these things. So the symbolism arose and it evolved into human culture. Remember, the symbolism was coming out of the unconscious, and collectively whole cultures are adopting the symbolism now because of a growing appreciation.
The common word for theurgy would be magic.
Right.
And so this is kind of the answer to it. Was he a Hexenmeister? What was he doing? But in the Red Book, he was putting himself in a deep trance state. And I've done things like this when I was in training. You can re-enter a dream and extend the dream. You can continue the experience, and it's interesting the way it will start to speak to you. It's not just you summoning it consciously. You can kind of reawaken it to extend itself, and the symbolism is beyond your conscious control. It's really a fascinating thing to experience.
So what we have here is the symbolism evolved into human culture because of its growing appreciation and the social utilization of these abstract likenesses between these objects and events that were separated in time and space, but there appeared to be some correlation between them. Now, he goes into fate, which he uses the Stoic term for fate, in the striking smile of Zeno, who was the founder of Stoicism. And this is like a fine thread, the thread of fate, running through the whole of existence. The world was to Stoics a live thing, like the invisible thread of life, which in heredity passes from generation to generation of living species and keeps the type alive. And it runs, causing forever, both the infinitesimal and the infinite. So it's on multiple levels, and it's very broad, and it's very, very detailed. This is, how Jung viewed these things, and it's an interesting view of trying to. We talked about Taoism and finding the path, and this is a different view of that. So then, if you accept the symbol, then all of a sudden a door opens, leading into a new room, and you didn't even know the existence of this because you didn't even see the door. But if you don't accept the symbol, then you just will walk right past the door. And since this is the only door that leads to the real inner chambers, you go wandering around outside, and everything is external, and you really don't advance at all. You don't deal with really what the inner activities are that is going on here. So the salvation is a long road that leads through many such gates, and these gates are all symbols. And this again is how Jung viewed this. And again, you could think of this as the thread of fate. So now he went back to summoning the demon.
It's not a demon, it's a daemon.
The daemon. And between 1918 and 1920, he began to understand the goal of psychic development is the self. The goal of psychic development is the self.
Which is anathema
So
to our Buddhists, our resident Buddhists.
this is what Jung feels. So there's no linear evolution. There's only a circumambulation of the self. So you keep spiraling, and you start to see what the self really is. And the uniform development exists only at the beginning, and later everything points to the center. Again, this circumambulation, the spiraling around the self. So the dynamic of the gods is really this psychic energy. And this is our immortality, the link through which man feels inextinguishably one with the continuity of life. So the dynamic of the gods is this psychic energy, and this is what he viewed as being immortal, that this collective unconscious that's everywhere, that links everything, that makes life continuous. So the psychic life force, which called the libido, symbolizes itself in the sun.
And he saw it as being far more spiritual than just physical, sexual energy. When his term of the word libido, it means life force or life or drive to life, not just sex drive, not just I think Freudian psychology is very reductive. It reduces everything to a sex drive. Whereas for him, it was like, it was a kind of heliotropism of the soul, you could say, the way a sunflower follows the sun. The human spirit follows the sun, whether it's the symbolic light or the literal physical sun.
So prayer or meditation is what establishes the links of friendship between humans and the gods. And it secures for us the triple advantage, which we gain from the gods through theurgy. The first leads to illumination. The second, to the common achievement of projects. The gods work with you to get things done. And the third, to perfect fulfillment of the soul. So you end up with what's happening here in the world around you, but you spiritually, your soul becomes fulfilled. So no sacred act can take place without the supplications that are contained in the prayers or in the meditation. So while Jung, I don't believe he was tied to any organized religion, but you could see this is what he believed. This is his view of of a religious experience.
I think he was really a practitioner of Gnosticism. That would be the way to put it, that he, his biggest religious practice, I think, was creating the Red Book. That's for him what it was really about. But I think it was also his connection with his clients was a way of connecting with the greater whole. And that they were instances of, these archetypal yearnings, but it was the human dimension of it that gave it meaning. And where he was really a soul doctor, he really was striving to help people who were suffering in various ways. That's why Pauli got in touch with him. He was suffering. He was that brilliant physicist.
So the diamond doesn't just guide one or another part of our being, but all of them at once. And it extends to us the whole administration of us. It's controlling all aspects, even as it's been allotted to us from all regions of the universe. So we have all the stars around us, as well as all the planets. And that is what is guiding us. The former, the theurgic procedures that are followed, well, one summons
And by the diamond, he means like your personal mythic figure, or the theme of the spiritual theme of your life, the patterns that your chart would show one level of, or one expression of. That's what he means by daemon. It's like the spirit of the time. It would be, let's say the age of Aquarius, emerging from the age of Pisces, but each individual has their own daemon as well. And a good place to see that is in the chart.
Right. So you can summon the daemon down from these higher or causal principles. The latter, or technical, you end up with one resorting to visible cycles of this generated realm, which for many people is the natal horoscope, the natal birth chart, and how you interpret it to lead to this horoscope. So the former operates on This is the theurgic procedures. The former operates on a more universal basis and transcends the realm of nature, while the latter, which is the technical side of things, conducts its worship on an individual level, following the dictates of nature. So we have this duality here that Jung liked. He liked to have these, the pairing of these things, and you'd swing between the yin and the yang.
You could think of them as kind of seeking each other, you know, the collective or the divine is striving for expression in human terms, and humanity is striving for the divine level at the same time, mutually. So the collective and the individual are reaching
Right.
for each other.
So finally, we reached the great fate. So the ancients devised magic to compel fate, and they needed it to determine what was called outer fate, and we need it to determine our inner fate and to find out the way that find the way that we're unable to conceive of. Okay, this is the hard issue. So somewhere out there, there must be some sort of determinant or some necessity which is conditioning the world. This creative determinant must decide what souls will again plunge into birth. This is a major thing, and it's possible that any further spell of life would have no more meaning once the soul had reached a certain stage of understanding. It would then no longer have to return to be reborn. But if there's a karma that still remains to be disposed of, then the soul relapses again, and perhaps has to be reborn again and again, till everything, whatever it is completed. So this is, again, Jung arguing for something like this happening here.
I love that phrase of the spell of three-dimensional life. It's really like our hallucination.
So you have to have a passionate urge toward understanding, which brought about birth. And I could well imagine I might have lived in former centuries and encountered questions that I was not yet able to answer. And so I had to be born again because I had not fulfilled the task that was given to me. So apparently this is why Jung felt that he was born again. So the karma of these past lives, mental, emotional, and in relationship to others, really demands all kinds of expressions, all kinds of ways of getting across all of these different aspects you had to deal with. And according to this temperament, there'll be a time of the birth of the body, and it must be born into the world at the right time when the physical planetary influences are really suitable, not just at your birth, but for the rest of your life. And it's thus born under a particular astrological star. It's not the star that imposes the temperament, but the temperament that fixes the epoch of birth under that star.
I love that. I think it's another really beautiful way of saying what Robert Hand and Stephen Forrest were saying the other night. But it's synchronistic and it's causal, and it's believed that at least this is an act of free will when we choose to be born, and we choose the chart to express the circumstances that will be the most conducive to us fulfilling that karma. So in the astrology that I was taught, the system that I was taught, and it's believed that you choose your parents, whether it's your adoptive parents or the parents you were born with, You choose the parents that you are going to end up with, and you choose all those familial patterns, and you choose your chart. And I love, that's called it, that's a transpersonal view of it. I like that so much because it just gets beyond the whole blame game with our parents. That just seems, again, too reductive to be realistic to me. They had their childhoods too, they have their scars and their limits, and we're just all kind of in this mess together. But that somehow we recognize ourselves in them and the opportunity for our growth in that particular family configuration. And so therefore, what's happening there is always meant to feed us, and it's the fertilizer that we grow in. And I feel, working with clients, for close to 30 years now, a lot of the best things that help us grow the most were what we perceived as lackings from our parents, from our families. Because that's where we have to learn to fill in for ourselves what we're going to do with our story. How are we going to write the middle and the ending, even if the beginning is written for us? It's never a death sentence. It's never a full stop. It's always got, it may not feel like the greatest hand, but there's always choice. There is always, at least in how we respond to situations and what we make of them, there is always that freedom. So I've found that kind of transpersonal view to be incredibly liberating. And that's part of the school of thought of humanistic astrology, that we are always working to empower the client rather than disempower them and tell them, well, this is your fate and you're stuck with it, and it's just always going to be this way, assuming that it's a lousy one. Some people are born with a grand trine and they really have kind of charmed lives. I wouldn't know what that's like because I have a grand cross, but those are said to be the charts that you grow the most from. Gandhi had a grand cross. It's from that feeling of feeling crucified that you are forced into your own resources. You're thrown back on yourself and have to grow in different ways because of the challenges.
The other thing is, you can see here that Jung is a interesting sort of agnostic. There's I would say a lot of Buddhist in his agnosticism, with trying to figure out, should I be reborn or not? What is my karma? What do I still have to accomplish here to do these things? And picking the right time, because of the confluence of the different planets and so forth, is critical to being able to achieve this. So it's a very nuanced agnosticism that I don't think you'll find with a lot of other people.
His religion is definitely not superstitious.
Right.
And I don't think he is literally relating to these sort of personifications as personages. I think he's doing a kind of imaginative exercise with them as archetypes, and it's just a lot more touchy-feely to relate to a father and a mother and a child than a principle, than some abstract principle, some intellectual idea.
So the power of fate ends up being felt unpleasant only when everything goes against our will. That is, when we no longer find ourselves in harmony with ourselves. And the power of fate, when you look at it in more detail, appears to be a compulsion of the libido. So each of us is equipped with a psychic disposition that limits our freedom and makes it practically illusory. So there's not a great deal of belief here in free will. We do not enjoy material freedom. We're continually threatened by psychic factors in the guise of natural phenomenon, which may take possession of us at any moment. And the principalities and powers are always with us. We have no need to create them, even if we could. So this is, again, the power of faith. Marcus Aurelius, who was the Roman emperor, I think around 180 AD, was also a Stoic. He wrote, that's what people remember him for his writings that were Stoic. And he said that the universe must be governed either by a foreordained destiny or an order that no one may step beyond, or by a merciful providence, or by a chaos of chance devoid of a ruler. And Jung said there's a considerable difference between perfection and completeness. Where the archetype predominates, completeness is forced upon us against all our conscious strivings. Okay, the individual may strive after perfection, but must suffer from the opposite of his intentions just for the sake of completeness. So it goes.
It seems to be that in Jung's view, wholeness is the goal of human existence. And that includes all our flaws. So that would be a vision of perfection that would include our lackings and our flaws and our imperfections, would be completeness and wholeness. Dave Rudger is a wonderful astrologer.
Jung was aware of him.
Yeah, he came of age in New York, I mean in America, in California, but he was from, I forget exactly where he was from. Do you remember?
No.
Like kind of Middle Eastern and European, and he was just a genius. He was every much a writer and a painter and a composer, as much as he was a really brilliant astrologer, technically and creatively and imaginatively. So he's up there. Liz Green is sort of like my kindred spirit of astrologers. And I just love that she took the time to do this book. This is all coming out of her book.
And these are, well, mostly everything we've gone through are quotes of Jung. Okay, there's very little interpretation here. So Dane Rudhyar is saying, again, this is what is to come. Okay, and so he's talking of the new Aquarian type of person. So we're actually referring to people through whom will be released the energies, the faith, the downflowing enthusiasm, and revelations of the new age, the age of Aquarius. And so these true Aquarians are mouthpieces for the new spirit, and many of them may be almost be called born mediums of that spirit at the beginning of the new cycle. So if you look around, you know, people would say, yep, that's what's going on right now. Sounds good to me.
And he was one, I would say, and so was Jung.
Yeah. So Jung then says, when the month of the twins, so we're dealing with what, Gemini?
Yeah, that would be Gemini, which is June.
End of June, okay. The men said to their shadows.
End of May, beginning of June.
Right, you are I, and then the two became one. And through this collision, the formidable broke out, precisely that spring of consciousness that one calls culture, and which lasted until the time of Christ. But the fish indicated the moment when what was united split, according to the eternal law of contrasts, into an underworld and an upper world. Okay, but the separated cannot remain separated forever. It'll be united again, and the month of the fish will soon be over.
So he's talking about the transition from the age of Pisces,
To the age of Aquarius.
right?
So,
And he's talking about it being a dual sign. Gemini and Pisces are two dual signs that deal with this dark and light kind of theme.
so in summary, what Jung was talking about here is meaninglessness just inhibits having a full life, and it's equivalent to some sort of illness. Meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. And no science will ever replace a myth, and a myth cannot be made out of any science. For it is not that God is a myth, but that myth is the revelation of a divine life in man. So again, everything is contained within you. And if you would take the time, then this meaning to life would become clear, and you would end up with an incredibly full, rich life.
This is what drew me to Jung and astrology, was that my life was so dry, and I had a really, really serious problem with depression, because it was just this kind of existential nightmare. There was no meaning there. It was also arbitrary and artificial. It wasn't till I sort of took this plunge that it became meaningful and alive for me. It was kind of the universe as a dead machine before.
Okay, so let's go. Let me get out of this. I'm just going to flip over to, hold on one sec. Here it is.
Do we want
Are there
to
any
break for any comments?
any questions that anyone has?
Heavy stuff.
Were you saying something, Barbara?
No, it was Nancy. I said
Oh.
heavy stuff.
Yeah. So here we have,
For me, it kind of turns reality inside out in a way that.
Yeah, but
it's
you
hard to
gotta
talk
chew
about.
on it for a while.
yeah, and we're just touching upon it, but you'll get the handout, the recording, and we have our bibliography, so you can go look at all these things.
And we'll go back over it again next year if you stick
Yeah.
around. We'll go
Right.
deeper each year.
So here we have Jung's.
Art, can you back that out a little bit so we can see the whole?
Yeah, I'm trying to see. Let's see.
You want to make it a little smaller.
Yeah,
Can I make it smaller? Let's see. Is there any?
And these glasses.
Is there anything here? This is an acrobat is the problem. So let me
What go there?
go to this.
Yeah,
yeah.
no, it's fine.
Oh, that's a find. How do I get rid of this?
Oh, let's just try this. There.
There we go.
Oh.
Try it one more if you can.
One more.
Yeah.
And then scroll up a little. So
Yeah.
charts usually have, this is the aspects, which are the relationships between the planets, are delineated here.
So
So you
so what do
see-
you have at the
see-
top? You have the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus,
Mars,
Mars,
Jupiter.
Jupiter, Saturn,
Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto.
the North Node. That's Lilith
Okay,
and Chiron. Chiron is a comet that's caught in orbit between Saturn and Uranus.
and there's
that
many of them.
astrologers-
And so that's what's running down
Astrologers.
here, top on the bottom, top to bottom.
And then
And then-
these are, I can't show them with
What, you
with the
wanna-
pointer here. These are the aspects between them. So Mercury here on the left and the moon above are in sextile. And that's dividing the circle by 6. So here, if we go up, we can find, here's the moon. And now where is Mercury? This one, the first one here is Mercury, and Venus is right next to it. So the moon is sextile both Mercury and Venus. So we can see that here. And then here it's showing that Mercury is conjunct the moon. That means they're within 10 degrees of each other. I'm sorry, that Mercury is conjunct Venus. They don't get very far apart normally, and they don't get very far from the sun.
So why not go back up now to the circle and talk about how this got.
So
Right
this
up.
is a snapshot of the sky at the exact minute of Jung's first breath. That's what it's showing. And so that's where the synchronicity is felt to come in that it is this snapshot. It's as if you're lying on your back and the sun sets to your right hand and it rises on your left hand. And you're lying on your back with your head up at the top and your feet down at the bottom. And this would be the night sky that you would see overhead. So the sun rises on your right, on your left, and that's the east. So it's a little counterintuitive. And it sets on your right hand, which is the west. But that's because you're lying on your back looking up at the sky. You're not looking down at the earth. The earth is in the center of the chart. And that's said to be where we are having our experience. So that's why it's geocentric and not heliocentric. I think the ancients all knew that the earth traveled around the sun. I don't think that was in debate. But here you're looking at it from the point of view of where you are. So it's knowingly subjective. So the thing that you see the most prominent in terms of elevation that's Jupiter. All the glyphs for the planets are a combination of a circle, a cross, and a crescent. And that's all meaningful. They're symbols of the cross is the body at high noon. The circle is said to be the spirit, and the crescent is the soul. The spirit is more collective than the soul, which is more individual. So here's one of my favorite glyphs. I'll blow it up for a minute, is Pluto. That's probably my single favorite one. It's a circle with the crescent under it, and the circle suspended. It's not touching anything. So it's just pure spirit floating up there and over the crescent of the soul, and the crescent is supported by the cross of the body. So it said that we were all crucified when we were born into matter. You know, we're all spiritual beings having a physical experience, not the other way around. And that the experience of coming down from the absolute, from heaven, is a feeling of persecution and crucifixion for our consciousness that is always exiled from the unity and the infinite divine love. So being human is by definition an experience of separation and exile and crucifixion. And that's what the symbolism of the rosy cross is. And Rosicrucians are working with that. This is Neptune, and you see the same, a lot, very similar symbolism, the cross, and there's the crescent. So Neptune is the last planet before Pluto. Pluto is showing this kind of, really transcendent state with that circle that's completely suspended and unattached to anything, rising above the crescent of the soul. This is the comet that I mentioned earlier, and that's got a circle at the bottom, and it's almost like a kind of cross. Here's Venus is the circle above the cross. The traditional symbol for Mars used to be a cross above the circle. So that showed the supremacy of the body over the spirit, and that's Mars represents force and war and violence and sex per se, whereas Venus, which is the spirit of the circle over the cross of the body of matter, that's love. Venus is the goddess of love. So that's their paired opposites that go together. That it's said that there's really 6 signs with 2 opposite faces. So making up 12.
Mhm.
So this is Jung's son. He was born just about sunset. Here we have 7:30 p.m. in the town of Switzerland where he was born. So this is the descendant. That's where the sun sets, and that's where his son was located. And this is considered to be the rectified time of birth that people have used. You can do exercises where you can see calculations. If you count the number of degrees between the angles and a planet, you can narrow down the time of birth. My time on my birth certificate's at 9:30 in the morning on a Sunday. And the rectified time is doing this exercise of counting the degrees between planets and the angles. It all fits like this perfect clockwork to be 9:26. And that's considered to be kind of average, 4 minutes before they wipe up the baby and write down something on some piece of paper somewhere. But it's supposed to be the first breath is said to be your commitment to the earth plane. So Jung's sun is on the descendant, and this line here means that it was 120 degrees to the midheaven. And those are the 2 axes of the chart. One is horizontal, that's the ascendant descendant axis. And then the vertical one is the midheaven, and we just abbreviated the IC, the Latin is Imam Coli, and that's like the midnight point of the chart. This is the noon part, this is sunrise, and this is sunset. So there's kind of 4 quadrants. This is Jupiter, which is the crescent above the cross. And Jupiter is considered to be the greater benefic, and it rules expansion. But that can be a negative thing. It often shows up with cancer. And the cells are multiplying and replicating like crazy. But so that's not necessarily a good thing. But that is expansion. The opposite is considered to be Saturn, which is the cross above the crescent. So when the crescent is above, that's said to be the soul above matter. And the opposite is when the cross is above the crescent. So Saturn is said to rule the principle of constriction, which we usually experience as a negative. But if you're curtailing an expansion of Cancer, then that's a good thing, you know. So even in Dante's time, he made this distinction. It depends on what you're talking about, whether it's good or bad. It's simplistic to consider Venus a benefic and Mars a malefic, and then Jupiter is the greater benefic and Saturn is the greater malefic. Saturn and Jupiter together are said to create regulated growth. And that's what we see here with his Jupiter trine, his Saturn. A trine is an easy aspect. That's 120 degrees out of 360. So that's considered to be really good for, say, growing a business. If you grow too quickly, you can't keep up with your orders and you can collapse, you know. And that happens to a lot of companies that just haven't planned properly and haven't financed properly to be able to grow. What you would want to see is slow, steady growth at a sustainable rate. And nowadays, the stock market, so much of it is just about growth. You know, it's just complete Jupiter, and that's not a good thing. You want to have that balance. So he was able to do that, and it's said that Jupiter represents learning and education, and Saturn represents wisdom. So the two working together, you can see the expansion of Jupiter is always sort of acquiring new territory, whereas Saturn is absorbing the lessons and structuring them. He has this nice little configuration here. This is a trine, and then there's a sextile between his Saturn and Mars, and then again another sextile between Jupiter and Mars. So that's why this triangle is there. So that usually translates as talent and really good timing. And that's the Mars and Jupiter together. A lot of musicians have that. So I think he was able to balance his growth and expansion and discipline. He was extremely disciplined. And Jupiter often represents travel. That's a way of expanding your experience and your mind. He didn't travel much. He spent most of his time in that little village in Switzerland, but he was in touch with people around the world. He corresponded with people continually. That's another book that's coming out, you know, of just incredible letters. So this is all kind of a fortuitous combination of drive with Mars, discipline and focus with Saturn, and expansion and growth with Jupiter. And they were kind of checked each other and kept each other in balance. So you didn't just have completely out of control growth or completely out of control will and drive would be Mars, or you can have total inhibition and fear with a very strong Saturn. You see a lot of people just have free-floating anxiety with that. Another configuration here, so that was all easy flow. They've done experiments with transmitting radio waves between planets in these configurations. And when they're in a soft angle, which is, I don't know why, it doesn't make any sense. It's the family of the 60s and the 30s, 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 120. The radio waves will be carried more smoothly. straight ahead. When the waves are transmitted between two planets in a square aspect, and I think this is from the point of view of Earth, I'll have to double check it. The waves are made more jagged, they're interrupted, they're interfered with by the square energy. So here he's got a square between his moon and Uranus, and another one between his sun and Neptune. So those would be considered challenging aspects, because the sun and moon are our two most personal planets. The sun is our conscious identity, our conscious ego, and the moon is more our instinctive inward self. And it's considered to usually be feminine, and for a lot of men, it's not conscious at all. They project it onto the women in their lives, their mother and their wives usually. So in the bio that went with this, they kind of made a lot of it. I know it came up in the class that Jung, in essence, he really almost had two wives. He had a mistress that he worked with very closely, and his wife, and she wasn't just, you know, like a mother figure cooking in the kitchen. She became an analyst, and she was very scholarly in her own right as well. So that, they say, is reflected in the square between the moon, which often represents a man's mother or wife, and Uranus means something unusual and eccentric and unconventional with Uranus. And it's also in the 7th house, which represents committed one-to-one relationships and partnerships. So the sun there means that was important to him. Partnership was central to his identity. I think that's where he really thrived. And that there would be something unconventional or nonconformist about his marital relationship, you could say, is shown by Uranus being in that house. For me, it's on the cusp of the IC of my 4th house. And I think most people would consider my family to have been pretty eccentric and unusual, and I would say pretty chaotic. Those are all kind of Uranian qualities. And Uranus rules astrology, among other things. So it is usually strong in people who have a strong interest in it. I have 3 planets in Aquarius, which is ruled by Uranus. So the language has different parts of speech that can restate the same kinds of themes in different ways. So the moon being very close to Pluto means that he had very serious connection with women, with his mother. And there's an interesting little anecdote in this write-up. I don't think we got it into the system for you, but we'll mail it to you.
We love our new apartment.
They talk about a dream that he had. He began. Well, it was a terrifying dream about his mother. So I think that was, you could say that was part of what drew him towards psychology. And these weren't comfortable aspects. The Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter was all very easy and comfortable, And I think that was, he loved building things. He loved making things. He loved doing art and crafts, and that's where all of that was. This kind of easy flowing, harmonious eh, hobbies and things like that. All of this, there's a lot more Sturm und Drang. There's a lot more drama with squares, which conventional astrology would consider to be negative, but modern astrologers don't consider them to be negative, just more energetic. So it's often what you, as I was saying about my chart with a grand cross, it's more what you make of it. And you're more likely to make more of it than just a lot of easy flowing energy. So the challenges push you to develop more. This is a T-square, this red triangle between his Venus, which is love, and Jupiter, which is expansion and learning, and Chiron. So, right, wait, this isn't a grand, this isn't a T-square. This comes down to here, and this goes up here. So it's an open one, which is even harder because it's less resolved. So he had some monsters, I would say. He had some real challenges, particularly in his intimate relationships with women. But they stimulated him, and he was extremely liberated in his day. He took women very seriously, and he empowered them. He had quite a few women in his circle who were fully initiated into the upper realms of analysis, and Marie-Louise von Franz is one, and she did extraordinary research into fairy tales and wonderful writing about fairy tales as like folk myths, and the way children understand them and develop them is really quite deep. You know, they're not all happy stories about, you know, princesses marrying, you know, men with glass slippers and things like that. If you read the original, especially like the German, the Grimm fairy tales, there's a lot of angst in there. There's a lot of darkness. And a lot of children are very aware of a lot of darkness. Unfortunately, a lot of children are abused and survive all kinds of amazing things, you know, grow up to be troubled people. But so Marie-Louise von Franz is an extraordinary researcher and writer. I took a lot of classes at the Jung Institute in fairy tales when I was in New York. And I just thought it was endlessly fascinating. And they really are like myths. So then there's just little odd snippets here and there. So a lot of this will turn up. We'll send you this article that was written to show a lot of the details in the chart that come out. They're talking here about fainting spells. Now, I wouldn't even know where to look for that. So I'd have to research that. I'd have to read. But people with Sun in the 7th house very often, and Freud had this as well, work with clients. They're very oriented toward the other. They're not self-oriented. They're very motivated to reflect the other person back to themselves. And so partnership is extremely important to them. And I think he had an incredible compassion for his clients and wanted them to have the sense of meaning that he found in his studies of the psyche. He was a healer, he was a doctor. That's often referred to as the sixth house. And he has Venus and Mercury there, which means that he applied his compassion and the left brain is represented by Mercury, whereas the moon is said to represent the right brain and intuition. So they're in the sixth house of healing, which and Cancer, in the sign of Cancer, is there. So I think he really applied his intellect with as much compassion as he possibly could summon. I think he had a very gentle kind of way of really working really hard not to be invasive, because I think his insight was so extraordinary. He could have been extremely invasive, but to always make sure that it was gentle and affirmative and something supportive and positive for his patients. And he really wanted people to have a sense of meaning. Does anything jump out? You know, I always invite my clients to look at the chart as a mandala, because I believe it will speak to you instinctively, even if you don't know what all the little squiggles are, the patterns. And I usually give them color printout. The red is showing square aspects. They're in the 90-degree family, which are, as I said, the more energetic, and they usually come out as a kind of tension, whereas the trines are easy flow and less resistance. But the squares are what get us up out of bed and get us doing and acting and give us issues to resolve, which is felt to be where our greatest growth comes from. So I know when somebody has a lot of trines in their chart, it's a kind of a coasting lifetime for them. It's not a real hard working lifetime. It's maybe it's a reward for the previous one that was really difficult. So it's just kind of charmed. And they're usually gifted in amazing ways, you know, with talents and very fortunate relationships and relations. Whereas those of us with a cross to bear are usually forced to grow from the challenges. And they say, you know, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. So that's what happens with a lot of crosses or a lot of squares.
Stop. You done?
What's the green?
Pardon me?
What's green?
The
What's
green?
Green, now those are,
these are green.
there's one here. Those are quincunxes, which are kind of in between. They're not easy, they're not hard. They require a lot of adjustment. It kind of feels uncomfortable and like you have to shift and change your position. It sets up like a seesaw. So his is between Jupiter and Pluto, which isn't a terribly tough combination. That can lead to, Jupiter can be very fortunate, and Pluto, it usually leads to abundance of some kind. And he was successful in his life. He lived in a beautiful house on a lake. It creates this constant imbalance and need for adjustment. My parents were in a quincunx pattern in their relationship, in their, both of them had a stellium. My mother had 4 planets in Sagittarius. My father had 6 planets in Cancer. And so that's, I think, why I understand Bart has 6 planets in Scorpio. It's a lot of water. And they were like apples and oranges. It's not a square, which is at cross purposes, and it's not an opposition, but it's also not a trine. So the flow isn't easy. There are different elements. This is Taurus, and this is Libra. In that case, you could say they're both ruled by Venus, so they would have that in common. Taurus is usually considered the more sensual, earthy one, and Venus is, Libra is the more emotional and relational. But they're not per se incompatible. It's just they don't really relate. They're just kind of apples and oranges. You know, my mother was a communist sympathizer in the 50s and 60s. And so she'd always say, well, you know, we have to try. At least they're trying something different. And my father would say, but it'll never work. It's against human nature. They're not going to really be altruist. They're going to end up corrupt, and it'll never work. And she'd say, but you have to try. At least they're trying. I'd say, yeah, but it will never work. And so I kind of grew up with that dialogue between them all my life. So that's a quincunx kind of pattern, which they say again leads to growth and insight, because it's a kind of discomfort. It's not excruciating. It's not as challenging as a square or an opposition. It's all an invitation to grow. It's an invitation to grow in various ways. Some harder, some easier, some more pleasant. When we look at 2 people's charts interacting in a relationship, you don't want to see all easy aspects, but you don't want to see all hard aspects either. There has to be some, you know, refuge at times. There has to be a break, but there also has to be growth, or the people will just get bored. If there's no challenge, if there's no growth. So good question. Thank you.
Very interesting.
I obviously think so. I started studying it in 86. And I haven't done as much as I would like in the past 10 years because I had so much else on my plate. And the transit that I was having, which lasted about 10 years, was Pluto conjunct my moon, which I say is like being rotor-rooted. You're just turned inside out by Pluto is the farthest from the sun, and the moon is the most personal. So Pluto is the most impersonal and closest to outer space. So you feel turned inside out by these really impersonal forces, almost of like history.
Okay, it's 9:09, so it's been a couple hours. I think that's it for tonight, and we will reconvene a week from now to go through Labyrinth. So thank everyone for participating. Have a wonderful weekend.
And you can bring questions back if you have any more.
Labyrinth is down there at you guys, or are you guys doing something different?
Oh, it's going to be a lecture.
Okay.
It's going to be a lecture on Labyrinth.
We decided not to do it in person
There's
Because-
still enough COVID running around. And it's,
We're outside.
yeah, well,
With the one that we use, I have a canvas, it's like
Oh.
24 feet across that we put inside, we put in the sanctuary, or we were thinking of renting a yoga studio. They were actually open to it. But there's just too much COVID going around, and I'm too vulnerable. I'm afraid to get that.
Yeah.
And I can't get vaccinated anymore, so.
Well,
So-
thank you. It was a wonderful evening, lot to think about, a lot of interesting thoughts, pretty fascinating. We'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.
okay,
Good
bye-bye.
night. Thank you for listening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.